The metal-clad ZMC-2 had been moved to the Cape May hangar to make room for the conventional rigids. During one experimental flight, ZMC-2's interior pressure was reduced to atmospheric and she was flown at 20 miles an hour. But she was never considered a true rigid airship. Back at Lakehurst, Commander Alger Dressel relieved Rosendahl on the 22nd of June, 1932, as Akron's caretakers began a series of improvements. The missing number 3 prop was replaced with a Hamilton Standard steel adjustable propeller. All the wooden props would be replaced. Handling the big ship on the ground continued to be a ticklish exercise. The landing party's smoke indicated readiness and wind direction. Bow hatches were opened and the coiled yaw lines dropped for connection to the yaw cars riding on the circular track. Because Lakehurst had been laid out without knowledge of the prevailing winds, 2 mooring circles had been built. Flight was always conducted from the further out mooring or operations circle. With the bow secured against lateral movement, the coupling party respectfully waited for the bow line to discharge the ship's accumulated static. Then the bow line was coupled to the winch line that passed through the mooring cup. As the yaw lines were also drawn in, the mast's powerful winch reeled the nose spindle into the mooring cup. Water was pumped aft to lower the tail as the stern party managed the operation with spider lines. A taxi or jury wheel was attached, and the mast pulled the airship to the closer-in docking circle. Lieutenant Calvin Bolster developed the 90-ton steel stern beam, which was pulled to the docking circle by a squat 133-ton gas-electric locomotive. The huge stern was attached to the beam with an elaborate bridle. Then X-shaped reinforcing members were brought in. The reinforcing frames were drawn up to the ship's tail and bolted in place to help transfer the load to mainframe 17.5. The powerful locomotive then pulled the stern around against the wind to line up with the hangar's docking rail. Once lined up, the beam's alternate wheels were winched down, and the beam's weight was transferred to the straight tracks of the hangar docking rails. Spreader gear, wheeled pipes running from the heavy mast to the stern beam, was connected and adjusted. With the spreader gear, the moving mast could push or pull the heavy beam in or out of the hangar without straining the lightweight airship structure. Undocking was the opposite procedure. Once clear of the hangar, the beam was aligned with the docking circle and the alternate wheels were winched down. The spreader gear was removed, the locomotive was connected, and the stern was pulled parallel to the wind. The tail was then floated free from the beam and the beam was pulled away. The taxi wheel was mounted and the mooring mast pulled the airship by its nose out to the operations circle. On the 22nd of August, there was another ground handling accident as the mast was moved before the stern beam was free. Several girders were damaged and the Akron was laid up several weeks for repairs. Once centered in the second circle, men stationed in the tail unbolted the handling X-frames and lowered them to sailors outside. A taxi dolly was used if the ship was to remain on the circle. The bamboo frame bumper bag, which could absorb slight tail impacts, was attached in place of the heavy taxi wheel. Meanwhile, the first production F-9C2 Sparrowhawk arrived in August and deliveries continued into September. One by one, the aircraft were flown down from the Curtiss factory in Buffalo. The Navy eventually purchased the XF-9C2, and the XF-9C1 was modified to be more like the new planes. It was decided each airship would get half the production run, so 4 new Sparrowhawks were designated as USS Macon's complement. At flying speed, the airship would burn 2,000 pounds of fuel every hour, and water was recovered to make up the weight. Engine-driven pumps were used to move the water into bags forward and aft, as the enormous vehicle required constant trim adjustments. Each green toggle on the altitude pilot's control panel emptied 2 water bags per bay, but the original exhaust water recovery radiators could not condense the required pound of water per pound of fuel burned. Cleaning the sooty pipes was a job dealt out as punishment, and they had already begun to corrode. To overcome the problem, the Lakehurst innovators developed the Mark IV water recovery apparatus. First installed on Engine 7, the Mark IV provided 1-to-1 recovery. A pound of fuel burned produced a pound of water ballast. As mission schedules permitted, The Mark IV would be installed on all other engines. In addition to being lighter, it was more streamlined and easier to clean. Airplane handling was simplified by eliminating 300 pounds from the airship's trapeze. Lieutenant Trapnell spearheaded improvements in the trapeze that removed the third pole and its clumsy steadying arms. His new centering fork and a fuselage steadying saddle kept the airplane from pitching during launch and recovery. Crewmen utilizing boat hooks could engage wing grips to guide the airplane past the door. It was found that two of the Akron's girders prevented the aft two airplanes from reaching their stowage positions. The list of things to do included hinging these beams, as well as providing work platforms to allow the airplane's wheels to be removed during missions. Outside, a fixed trapeze or perch was installed on frame 102.5. This allowed a plane to save fuel while the moving trapeze was occupied. Like those of a flat-top ship, the heavier-than-air detachment became its own distinct unit. The cocky pilots had their planes painted with colorful fuselage bands and then painted the wheel pants and cowlings to match. A formation of three would form red, white, and blue, just like the standard Navy rudder painting. During the summer, Skipper Dressel followed a reserved flight schedule, each mission honing the crew's skills and evaluating the new equipment. Other improvements came along in spite of the tight Depression-era budget. An enlisted men's smoking room was added just aft of their quarters and head. The command of USS Akron passed to Commander Frank McCord. As 1933 made its debut, McCord set about making the Akron perform. The ship's own armament was addressed as 30 caliber machine gun mounts were established at good vantage points about the ship. McCord took the Akron and her Man on the Flying Trapeze act down to star in the Miami All-American Air Races. Later, Akron carried on a tradition by showing up at the inauguration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, just elected on a platform of balancing the budget. The bitter, stormy weather of Lakehurst often kept the airship in her hangar. Commander McCord was interested in a better winter base for his airship. Caribbean fleet exercises brought Akron and her planes down to Opelika, Florida, where a mast and riding out circle had been constructed. The airshipmen dodged rattlesnakes and swatted mosquitoes in their tent city at this Class B facility. A mast base had been set up at Guantanamo, Cuba. Los Angeles had moored there. Akron overflew the site, which would later be enlarged to a Class B facility to handle the bigger airships. Later, she scouted the Panama Canal Zone during the exercises. On one trip, an N-2Y was sent to the surface, and the pilot returned with a front cockpit full of lobsters. Attention would shift to her sister ship as the USS Macon was christened on March 11, 1933. Only 5,000 persons braved the unheated air dock to watch Mrs. William Moffett, herself from Macon, release the symbolic birds of peace. After the airship was allowed to rise, the speeches were mercifully short. Admiral Moffett must have suspected scarce funds meant Akron would have to be decommissioned so Macon could operate. There would be a different chief of aeronautics to worry about that problem, however, as William Moffett was scheduled to retire within a few weeks. At this time, out in Mountain View, California, the new station was associated with the nearby town of Sunnyvale. Finishing touches were being added to the most modern LTA facility in the world. The ultra-modern air dock dominated the Spanish-influenced architecture of the facility. Opening ceremonies were scheduled in 1 month's time, and their new airship would be arriving shortly thereafter. Meanwhile, the globe-trotting Graf Zeppelin continued to rack up successful transoceanic trips carrying 20 passengers in luxury. The masters of the rigid airship had begun building the LZ-128, a new ship larger than the Graf Zeppelin, but it was scrapped in favor of a dual-gas design. With the performance of the American ships as a benchmark, a 7 million cubic foot design was developed. Instead of starting off with partially empty cells, the new LZ-129 would use hydrogen cells within helium cells. The cheap and replaceable hydrogen could be vented to compensate for fuel weight consumed in flight. A walkway at the ship's center line would provide access to the inner cell's valves for maintenance. Back in America, on the evening of April 3, 1933, Admiral Moffett arrived at Lakehurst and the Akron was rolled out for a routine mission. She was to help calibrate some Army ranging stations the next morning, so no life jackets seemed to be necessary. The weather looked too rough for airplanes, but Commander McCord ordered an N2Y standing by in case Admiral Moffett had to return to Washington before the mission was complete. During the night and into the next morning, the weather deteriorated. An aircraft's height above the ocean's surface was measured by using a barometer calibrated in distance. The storm overtook them and lightning flashed all around the ship. Unable to find a way out, Akron experienced rapidly changing air currents. She sank rapidly, then rose and sank again. The altitude reading at the bridge may have been off by several hundred feet. Wind shear may have cast her tail down as suddenly Akron's fins struck the water. The lower rudder carried away as she desperately strained upward at 45 degrees. Then she was slammed into the water and broke up in the heavy sea. Crewmen not injured in the crash scrambled to escape the hull, but not one of the crew had a life jacket. One by one they drowned or died of exposure in the chilling waters. Luckily, the German tanker Phoebus happened on the scene of what looked like to them an airplane crash. 4 men were rescued clinging to flotsam. Chief Radioman Robert Copeland died of his injuries that night. Moody Irwin, Richard Deal, and the ship's executive officer, Herbert Wiley, had been saved from drowning. At first light, the old training blimp J-3 was scrambled out to the rescue. But the little airship was no match for the powerful storm. An engine mount broke. J-3 had to be ripped in rough surf. Chief Bedio and Lieutenant Commander Cummings drowned. For the want of a better altimeter or a complete weather map, the legalization of 3.2 beer would have been the major headline on April 4th. Now the Akron's loss stunned the nation.
Death rode at the helm as the $5 million Queen of the Skies headed out over the Atlantic.
All the sensational headlines that dogged her during construction and operation were trotted out again.
But the Akron seemed marked for disaster from the beginning.
Earlier airship wrecks were dredged up.
She was only 17 months old when, with a crew of 76 aboard, she moved out to sea to her doom in a storm. Bits of wreckage marked her resting place.
Dr. Carl Arnstein was devastated, failing to report for work at Goodyear for several days. Fishermen had snagged their nets on the USS Akron a few weeks after her loss, and some wreckage was recovered by the USS Falcon. But subsequent investigations failed to determine what went wrong. Eventually, the second set of wind tunnel tests verified the fins were improperly stressed. While no one was sure the weakness had anything to do with Akron's loss, Arnstein and Company set about designing a fix. Sunnyvale was renamed Moffett Field in honor of the admiral who had fought for the Navy rigid airship. Others lost with Akron were honored with street names on that base. The Florida Air Base was named for the flag aide, Commander Henry Cecil. A gloomy atmosphere dominated the commissioning of the most modern Class A lighter-than-air base in the world, which went ahead as scheduled on April 12th. Moffett Field was a textbook example of a base built for rigid airship support. Since the hangar had been laid out along the prevailing wind axis, only one mooring circle was needed at each end. Back at Akron, the new airship was rolled out on the 21st of April, 1933. The ZRS-5 lifted off into a northeast wind for the first of what would be 82 hours of test flight. Weight saved in construction was apparent in her enhanced performance. Seemingly identical to her lost sister, USS Macon's streamlined louvered vents topped 3 valves per cell. Her prop mountings were equipped with fairings. The engine cooling radiators had been moved, attached to the hull, and covered with scoops. Even the bumper bags lost bulk in the streamlining effort. During a 48-hour endurance flight, she overflew Chicago's Century of Progress exposition. The mighty airship complemented the ultramodern architecture of the giant fair. Chicagoans had enjoyed buoyant vehicles since the turn of the century, but there would never be anything like this scene ever again. The citizens of Macon, Georgia had studied the possibility of building a mast so their namesake could visit there for the city's bicentennial in May. Macon had new, adjustable, 3-blade propellers fitted during trials. The improved streamlining allowed her to exceed the design contract speed. Veteran Akron Commander Alger Dressel took command and oversaw Macon's delivery to Lakehurst on the 15th of June. Admiral King, who replaced William Moffett as Chief of Bureau of Aeronautics, placed Macon in commission and the log was opened. The heavier-than-air detachment drilled in launching, finding the mothership, and hooking on the new Trapeze as Macon prepared for her permanent station assignment. The unit's senior officer, Lieutenant Ward Harrigan, had an art school design the detachment's official emblem, a fat trapeze artist swinging to capture a skinny one. On the 12th of October, Macon took a load of mail with her 50 tons of other provisions and departed Lakehurst for the last time. Macon overflew her Georgia namesake city for the first and only time early on the morning of the 13th. Tens of thousands perched on rooftops and hung out windows for their only chance to see their ship. Macon appeared at her new California base on the 15th of October. Lieutenant Young flew one of the F-9Cs up to hook on, adding needed ballast, since the ship had consumed 38 tons of fuel in her crossing. The new West Coast mobile mast, stern beam, and inexperienced ground crew were tested as Macon moored in the afternoon. Hangar number 1's doors were closed at sunset on what was supposed to be the first of many rigid airships to use the $5 million Sunnyvale facility. Macon occasionally thrilled Bay Area residents. Once the ship left Moffett Field, her planes would launch, catch up, and hook on. The airship could then easily handle their weight with dynamic lift. Heading south, Macon would occasionally use the Class B operations base at Camp Kearney, near the fleet's base at San Diego. Macon was seen over the city, occasionally thrilling residents by picking up an airplane from their local servicing facility at Naval Air Station North Island. Operations with the fleet undertaken in 1934 were similar to Akron's experiences the year before. Many in the Navy could not see the value of an open ocean scout and repeatedly misapplied her in close-in tactical situations. The F-9C had been designed as a carrier fighter. Tail hooks were reattached, and the pilots demonstrated a dual capability by operating from the flat-top USS Lexington. The heavier-than-air unit drilled in airplane handling. For the greatest weight during landing, the hangar's full 5-plane capacity could be utilized. However, operations proved it unwise to keep the Trapeze occupied. The Macon's outside perch was frequently occupied, and one more perch was planned for mainframes 80 and 57.5. The ship could eventually accommodate 8 airplanes. In the spring of 1934, Naval Air Command got wind of Macon's cocky HDA unit's unconventional paint schemes. Orders came to remove the symbols and blacken the tails for fleet uniformity. Hasty watercolors blotted out the red, white, and blue, and the man on the flying trapeze was retired. More capability came to the heavier-than-air detachment with the purchase of 2 Waco UBF model planes. Of much greater performance than the obsolete N2Ys, the 3-person Wacos, designated XJW-1, served as new running boats for the ship. Also equipped with a removable fuselage cover, the Wacos could carry a respectable cargo. By March of 1934, it was resolved the ship had adequate thrust to eliminate 2 engines and drivetrains. It would only cost Macon 2 miles per hour of top speed, while allowing a smaller crew and more fuel weight to extend her range by some 2,000 miles. Number 3 and number 4 water recovery systems were removed, and plans called for the propellers and engines to be removed later. Across the Atlantic, Germany's propaganda minister urged Chancellor Hitler to nationalize the Zeppelin service. A Goebbels memo emphasized the propaganda value of a technology the Germans practically owned, their heavily experienced operations having made consistent progress where other nations had failed. Goebbels conceded the United States still had the USS Macon, but he predicted the U.S. Navy's lack of experience would soon prove her undoing. Since the Americans rarely operated more than 1 airship and usually rotated people back to boat duty just as they were learning their airship jobs, the Germans did have the greater experience base. The Nazi government took over the Zeppelin operations. With an influx of government funds, the largest airship in history, the LZ-129, became a government construction project. Hugo Echner was promoted into a figurehead office. Back in Akron, Arnstein and Company had begun building a tail reinforcement kit for the USS Macon, but no one realized how soon it would be needed.